With these headlines, President Biden today signed a pledge along with Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid to ensure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon. One of the goals of Biden's Middle East trip this week is to drum up support from allies for restarting the Iran nuclear deal, which the Trump administration withdrew from. Biden said force is not off the table and is a last resort.
Made it absolutely clear. We will not, let me say it again, we will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon.
Biden made the comments at a joint news conference today in Jerusalem with Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid. The leaders met earlier in the day and discussed Iran's rapidly progressing nuclear program. Biden says the U.S. has outlined for Iran what it's willing to accept in order to rejoin the agreement. Biden says the U.S. is waiting for Iran's response, but won't wait forever. Inflation at the wholesale level climbed 11.3% in June compared with a year earlier. It's the latest painful reminder that inflation is running hot through the U.S. economy. The U.S. Producer Price Index, which measures inflation before it hits consumers, rose at the fastest pace since hitting a record 11.6% in March. The report on wholesale prices came a day after the Labor Department reported that surging prices for gas, food, and rent catapulted consumer inflation to a new four-decade peak in June, further pressuring households and likely sealing the case for another large interest rate hike by the Federal Reserve. Ukrainian officials say Russian missiles struck a city in central Ukraine today, killing at least 20 people and wounding about 90. Ukraine's national police said 3 missiles hit an office building and damaged residential buildings in Vinnytsia. The city is 167 miles southwest of the capital, Kyiv. The missile strike ignited a fire that expanded to engulf 50 cars in an adjacent parking lot. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said a child was among the dead. He called the attack an open act of terrorism against civilians in locations without military value. Meanwhile, government officials from about 40 countries met in The Hague today to discuss coordinating their investigations of potential Russian war crimes in Ukraine. Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has arrived in Singapore on a flight from the Maldives, where he had fled mass protests over his rule. Protesters blamed him for the country's economic collapse. More from Feature Story News' Ishan Garg in New Delhi.
Protesters in Sri Lanka are demanding President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's resignation. Many blame him for the country's worst economic crisis in the past 7 decades. Rajapaksa fled Sri Lanka on Wednesday, a day after promising he would resign. Remaining in office may be his only shot at legal immunity, especially as calls are growing to hold him accountable. Meanwhile, the parliament will vote to elect a new president next week. But economists believe any leader will find it difficult to pull the country out of its current crisis. Sri Lanka faces more than $50 billion in sovereign debt. And with a nearly extinguished foreign reserve, many believe a bailout may be the country's best hope.
That's Ishan Garg reporting. A heat wave spreading across Europe is fueling wildfires in Portugal, France, and Spain. Around 3,500 firefighters in Portugal are battling dozens of blazes as temperatures break records in various parts of the country. The worst has been reported in Leiria, where 600 people were forced out of their homes. Heat waves have become more frequent, more intense, and longer lasting because of climate change. The world has already warmed by about 1.1 degrees Celsius since the Industrial Revolution began. In France, about 1,000 firefighters are trying to control 2 major wildfires. The blazes in the southwest of the country have already burned about 4,000 hectares. Most of Spain was put on high alert on Wednesday, and the country's state meteorological agency said some regions were suffocating. The Andalusian town of Almonte recorded a temperature of 45.6 degrees Celsius on Wednesday. Spain's hottest day of the year is expected today. Meanwhile, in the UK, the heat wave is forecast to peak on Tuesday, with highs of 36 degrees Celsius. I'm Max Pringle.